Hello, this is Chek. Welcome back to my video blog. Today I thought I would shift after our long series on the 7 days of healing to something a little more physical for you. Today I'm going to talk about what I call the pivot shift. It's a simple but very, very important concept that I rarely ever see getting taught by exercise professionals or strength coaches, but it's very, very important. The pivot shift has to do with balancing the inertia of a weight that we're swinging and the changes in our center of gravity created by the movement of the load and the use of the mass and the mechanics of our own body. So I'm going to give you a couple of different demonstrations to help bring that into clarity for you. If we're doing something simple like a kettlebell swing, when we're swinging the kettlebell, if we don't use the pivot shift, then what happens is we tend to lean forward onto our feet, especially in this lower position, and we get a lot of leg activity and excessive back activity. And because we're actually accelerating the weight's trying to go that way. If we aren't careful, we tend to use our feet and pull back against the load with our arms. So we get kind of a lot of arm and leg activity that is basically inefficient. When we're training with weights, especially for sports conditioning, it's unlike bodybuilding because in bodybuilding, the goal is to isolate specific muscles and force the load through that tissue to trigger breakdown to stimulate hypertrophy. But as a guy who's trained countless elite athletes who have suffered loss of performance due to using bodybuilding techniques because they become biomechanically inefficient and over-reliant on muscular force, it's very important to realize that there's a natural mechanism built into our body to produce efficiency because in nature, food wasn't always readily available. So we learned through the environment and survival how to be more biomechanically efficient. So when we want to use the pivot, we want to pay attention that as we're swinging the weight and it's accelerating away from us. So here I have 20 kilograms, 44 pounds. It's going to be accelerating. The faster it goes, the more force it generates against me. So instead of using my legs and arms to fight back, as it's accelerating, as the load's accelerating, I'm pivoting from my hip joint. And how I'm moving also has to do with where the center of gravity is. If the center of gravity of the weight is below my belly button or my center of gravity, it's pulling it down. As the weight's going forward, my center of gravity is moving up with the weight and forward with the weight, so it's actually trying to pull me forward. If as the weight's swinging, I pivot against the weight and use the weight of my own body as a counterbalance, I can create an axis of rotation through the hips, and that allows me to use minimal muscular effort, and I get maximum efficiency. So what ends up happening is two things. One, you can lift more weight for the same number of reps because you're burning off less unnecessary energy. You're more mechanically efficient. Two, I can get more reps per set or per workout, so the total volume of training is higher, which means you're getting more effective neural programming in the motor system. As I often say to my students, repetition is the mother of skill, provided there is skill in the repetition. My wife Penny says perfect practice makes perfect. If you're just trying to blast the hell out of yourself to load muscles up strictly for the function of making muscle, then these things aren't so important, except for the fact that you can more easily get injured to the degree that your biomechanics are not ideal. So when I do the pivot, it has a nice, efficient feel to it. It's kind of almost like you're in a rocking chair and you're just effortlessly rocking, versus if I try to muscle it and then I don't get the pivot, or if I try to keep my trunk too vertical. Now I'm really having to do a lot of work in my back muscles versus matching the inertia of the load with the mass and movement of my own body in the opposite direction. Now this is also true, for example, with a medicine ball. If you want to accelerate the ball, you can throw the ball. You can jump, use a lot of leg power and a lot of arm power. Or as you're accelerating the ball, as it's coming up, you're leaning back and you're shifting your hips forward, so there's a natural pivot shift through the hips, and then you use the body weight and the inertia you're creating going in the direction you want the ball to go. And so there's a nice, beautiful efficiency, and then you accelerate with the legs to carry that momentum forward. Now, if we look at it with a squat, you'll see a very similar situation. If I'm squatting, as I'm coming down and I go through the sticking point, if I come up and I stay bent forward too much, I have to use my legs and then stand up. That puts a huge load on the low back. If we want to use the pivot, hip pivot effectively, one, if you just lift your toes when you're squatting, it helps move your weight back. In the squat or the deadlift, the load should go through the middle of the foot, between the balls of the foot and the heel. So with the pivot, as I come down, I naturally let my pivot drop back. And then as I come up, I'm using the hips to come forward and I'm pivoting backwards. So it creates a real nice, efficient movement, and it produces much more efficiency. If I'm deadlifting, the same basic issue applies. The difference is when you're doing a squat, your center of gravity moves up. The heavier the load on your back, the higher your center of gravity is going to go. And because the load's behind the mid-plane of your body, your center of gravity is going up and back. So in a squat, if you don't bend forward because of that, you have all that mass behind you. If you put 2 times your body weight, your center of gravity can be sitting literally outside of your body. So it creates a lever arm against you. In the deadlift, the weight's down, low, and so if you take this, let's say 3 plates aside, or even say double your body weight as an example, now when I grab the bar, my center of gravity is pulled down because I become one with the bar. As soon as I start moving it, my center of gravity is forward. So a low center of gravity and a forward center of gravity means I really have to extend back against the load. That, by the way, is why there's a neurological difference in the generalized motor program that the brain uses to differentiate a squat from a deadlift, because the way the brain has to orchestrate recruitment of the muscles is very different when the weight's up and high on your back than when it's low down on the floor, even though the actual, if you film the joints moving in a deadlift and a squat, it looks almost identical, but the way the brain's recruiting the muscles is very different. Point being, with the pivot shift, is as I lift the load in the deadlift, I'm coming up, I want to bring my hips forward and my trunk back. So there's a, just like there is with that kettlebell swing, right as the bar passes my knees, I'm coming up, and now my hips move forward, my trunk moves back. If you don't use that nice pivot, which you'll feel the load, it's almost like a pulley and it's moving right around the hip joint. It's very efficient, very natural. It makes even a heavy weight feel almost like it's lifting itself. If I don't do that, then the tendency might be for people, for example, whose legs are stronger than their back, you'll see the hips rising faster. So they come off the bottom, the hips rise up, and then they stand up. Versus hips coming up with trunk, hips moving forward, and then we counterbalance. So right here, there's that sweet spot or the pivot shift, and we want to keep that bar as close to the shins as possible, because even a centimeter of forward movement of the bar creates a huge lever arm against the low back. So the pivot shift allows you to be much more efficient. It gives you much better awareness of body mechanics, enhances athletic performance. For something like a medicine ball, it can increase the toss 5-10 feet in distance. For kettlebell lifters, it'll prolong how many reps you can do in any given set with a clean or a clean and jerk or a kettlebell swing. And it's just much better neural programming, and it trains the body to work the way Mother Nature would have wanted it to work to increase durability and survivability. So I hope you enjoyed my little lesson on the pivot shift and enjoy practicing. And if you want to learn more, you're welcome to join us for Chek Exercise Coach. Also, I go through a lot of weightlifting technique in my gym instructor video series. And there's also lots of great tips for you in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy. But we'd love to have you at Chek Exercise Coach, and hopefully you'll enjoy learning lots more from our highly skilled instructors. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Paul Chek.